name is Stubbs and Dr. I'm an Associate Professor of English Education at Hope College, and I have the honor of being the NEA Big Read and Little Read Lakeshore Director. The NEA Big Read Lakeshore and Little Read Lakeshore programs are month-long community-wide reading programs focused on the reading of a common book. This year, because of COVID, we've switched to a mostly virtual program. We're excited for the possibilities that this presents us as we can expand our audience's scope and reach, as well as our ability to connect with speakers and experts that are beyond our geographical reach. Thank you for joining us this year as we explore Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Heart of the Sea and Marcia Diane Arnold's Galapagos Girl Galapagos. We hope you enjoy these events and learn lots about the book's topics and themes, as well as issues and important questions in our world today.
Hello, I'm Daniel Flores for the NEA Big Read Lakeshore. Today we're speaking with David L. Stubbs, Professor of Ethics and Theology at Western Theological Seminary in Holland. David Stubbs was born and raised in Los Angeles. After receiving his BS and MS at Stanford University, David worked as a seismic engineer in San Francisco. While pursuing his engineering career, he also worked full and part-time in churches and ministries, eventually decided to change paths, go deeper in his faith, and explore his call to ministry. He received an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary and a PhD in theological ethics from Duke University, then settled into a professorship of ethics and theology at Western Theological Seminary here in Holland, Michigan. He's an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in PC USA. For many years, acted as co-chair of the Christian Systematic Theology section of the American Academy of Religion. He's a member of the Society of Christian Ethics and the Association of the Reformed and Liturgical Worship, and has worked on many committees on the local and national level of the PC USA. Dr. Stubbs is currently working with the Prison Education Initiative with Hope College, and he recently published Table and Temple, an insightful study that traces the central meanings of the Lord's Supper out from the worship of the Jewish temple into Christian worship. But not working on theology and ethics, he loves being in the great outdoors, making music, cooking with his wife Lynn, and sipping a good cup of coffee. Welcome, Dr. Stubbs. We can't wait to hear about In the Heart of the Sea, this year's Big Read selection. Please share with us your insights on this fantastic work of literature. This is The Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex. It's based on a true story. So tell us more about this book.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for that nice introduction. It's been great reading this book. It's how would you say, a whale of a tale, and I'd say also kind of a real feast of ethical issues, you could say. And so it'd be great to talk with you about a couple of the themes that I found and perhaps that you found in there as well. And maybe it'll open up the book to others who are going to read it for the big read. So, yeah, is there, I mean, as I looked at it, there's just a number of different ways you can enter into this story, which is like, you know, it's the backstory to Moby Dick. But there's so much about the whaling industry, about the people who are involved, their characters, things about leadership, things about race, and things about cannibalism that are all part of the story. And I don't know, maybe we can start with thinking a little bit about some of the culture of Nantucket and the way that things have been formed there.
Well, these are all very provocative topics. I would love to sit at table with you over this. Shall we dig in?
All right. Well, one of the things that struck me about the book is it really highlighted some of the character of the people who are living in Nantucket and the way that they were shaped both by the sea as well as by the whaling industry. I often think that the economy that we're in and our jobs and the ways that we make a living really form our character in deep ways. And so Nantucket's a really interesting place because it, in some ways, can be a symbol of much of the character of the United States as well. Yeah. So as I think about, what formed and shaped the people of Nantucket, I think that they were shaped by by the sea and by the whaling industry. And maybe I'll just say a little bit about both. Um, they were really shaped by the practices of the sea, I think, Dan. I was
Tell me
too.
more about that.
Yeah. I was too. I grew up in Los Angeles, and so I loved being around the ocean, being in the surf, and I've spent a lot of time myself doing some sailing. It's interesting. I did a little look for Nathaniel Philbrook, the guy who wrote this book, and he has a kind of an incredible sailing career himself. He was he went to Brown University and he won the nationals in the Sunfish, which is a certain kind of sailing boat, small boat. And he was also an editor for Sailing Magazine, and so you can tell that he's had a lot of sea experience himself. But I think that being around the sea and practices the sea shape us in a lot of different ways. One of the ways, so even the way it shaped me, I have some sailing experience myself, is if you think about the ocean and being on the ocean, you really kind of come close to issues of life and death. I mean, the water, it's a beautiful place, but it can also kill you. And I think as people begin to get to know the ocean, it forms them in a lot of different ways. You come to know your own mortality. And I think it shapes you in ways where you begin to deal with some of your fears, and it makes you develop, hopefully, some courage in yourself. I think too is just being on sailboats myself. One of the things that's interesting is how you get in touch with the power of the world around us, and it's being on the waves and in the middle of storms, you really gain a sense of humility, but also I think it also trains a certain kind of self-confidence that's part of people, and also the speed, the way that things change when you're out on the water is really interesting to me too, and it comes out in the book quite a bit. In that one section where the whale actually sinks the ship, there's so much action that happens there, but all of that happened, they said, within 10 minutes, sort of from start to finish. And I think just being on a sailboat and being out in the middle of the ocean too, you see how quickly things change, and it causes you to have to make a lot of quick decisions. And so I think actually being around the sea and sailing is a great way to form people's character in really positive ways. And I think that was part of the people of Nantucket. In fact, there was a quote that in some ways intrigued me. It's on the introductory pages, page 13 in small. It's in the preface. Where is it? It says, he mentioned that this was like an experiment. He says that, but the point at which Melville's novel ends, the sinking of the ship, was merely the starting point for the story of the real-life Essex disaster. The sinking seemed to mark the beginning of a new kind of terrible laboratory experiment devised to see just how far the human animal could go in its battle against the savage sea. I thought that was interesting because he talks about, Philbrook uses words like the savage sea or the inhuman sea. And there's more to it than that. Certainly it's this really powerful force, but he almost begins to name the sea as kind of this very kind of evil aspect to it. And I think he might do that just kind of for poetic reasons. And it was kind of intriguing to me, since he's a sailor himself. I think he would think of the sea as more than simply kind of this evil and savage force. So I thought that was kind of interesting to see how he often names the sea in kind of these inhuman or savage characteristics. So, but I think the sea can form people in all sorts of different ways.
Do you see any analogy to that in biblical language about chaos or Jesus taming the sea, or where do we find some type of parallels or faith responses to the mystery of the sea?
Yeah, yeah.
Why are we drawn to it so?
Well, I think that's it. It's like certainly, a lot of in biblical language, it's and imagery. The sea is kind of this place of chaos, and it is almost this symbol of this kind of savage and evil force that Jesus calms and is able to have power over. And I think that's part of it. And but there's also other aspects of the sea, I think, that can really shape us and form us in really positive ways as well.
Can you say some more about the positive influences of the people of Nantucket, shaped by the sea, but there are other influences at play here? Is it in terms of the economy or faith? What was really impacting? What made them who they were?
Yeah, well, Philbrick also mentions that their Quaker background, which was kind of this pacifist background, and yet so they weren't allowed to sort of kill each other, but they were tremendously. He talks about their kind of savage bloodlust for killing of the whales, and that's the intriguing aspect too, because they had this one kind of religious attitude, and yet their practice of whaling kind of pointed them in another direction. So I've thought a lot about whaling and what that might mean, and the kind of the forces, the ways that it shaped people there too. Hunting whales, how. Here's a question that I would have: what kind of culture should be formed in relationship to whales? It's interesting for me that this whole whaling thing is coming up in today's age. Whaling was banned as a commercial practice in 1986, and there's a certain kind of savage aspect that Philbrick brings out in the book. Here's a great quote on page 13 in the first chapter, where he talks about the people and the way that whaling shaped them. So on page 13. He writes, no matter how much the inhabitants might try to hide it, there was a savagery about this island, a bloodlust and pride that bound every mother, father, and child in a clannish commitment to the hunt. I'm sort of intrigued with that. It's, what should our relationship to a creature like the whale, as well as other animals, be? Can there be a certain way that people like Quakers could also hunt in ways that weren't quite so savage and bloodlusty? So here's the aspect of you can even frame it in terms of justice. In terms of the sea, what do we owe the sea? We owe a respect, and we owe skill, as we kind of deal with things in the sea. But with whales, they're kind of an amazing creature. They have one of the largest brains. Some of them, humpback whales, sing. The sperm whales, like dolphins, they use echolocation, and so it seems they have pretty high reasoning skills and even a language. At least some of them have a language. I know dolphins can see themselves in a mirror and recognize themselves. They name each other through their clicks in the herd. So what kind of attitude and practices should we develop in relationship to these creatures? Some people should say should never kill them or hunt them. I'm actually raising chickens right now, and so I have questions about what this looks like. In our modern world, sometimes it seems like we pendulum swing between either saying that we can't kill or hunt. That's sort of the vegan option, and then the other side is like, well, no, it's everything's on. But I actually find that people, at least some people that hunt and deal with the death and the eating of animals, is like they also develop a really deep respect for animals. So I think the whaling industry is an interesting one, because even as you look at the way that Philbrick talks about it, it seems like it starts off in a pretty small scale, and in ways that I think respected the whales. And by the time, this was 1820. 1820 is really the start of the Industrial Revolution in America, and that's really close to the time of the setting here. It seems like there's, how would you say, a dehumanization of the whales or a de-whaling of the whales. There is a great quote in one of the, it was Enoch Cloud. It was on, so I have this written down on page 54, where one of the whalers, he goes out to sea, and he says this. He says, Enoch Cloud, who kept a journal during his voyage on the whale ship, he says that these sentiments are telling. And here's the quote from his journal. It is painful to witness the death of the smallest of God's created beings, much more one in which life is so vigorously maintained as the whale. And when I saw this, the largest and most terrible of all created animals, bleeding, quivering, dying a victim of the cunning of man, my feelings were indeed peculiar. Yeah, peculiar is an interesting word. I would say at other places they talk about them being desensitized. He's turning from an elf to an orc, you could say, to use Tolkien's imagery. But I am wondering about what it might mean to hunt whales well. What would that look like? Even if I thought about this, I thought about kosher practices. There's different ways that even Jewish rabbis have of killing animals. There's different ways that we can hunt and respect animals that I think better respect and do justice to who they are. And so it feels like that, Philbrick in this book is naming a lot of these tensions between some of their religious understandings of God and themselves as creatures, and then some of their own economic practices in this hunting of the whale, where they become desensitized. He uses the word desensitized to the wonder of the whale at one point in the book as well. So for me, it raises questions about the ways that the people in Nantucket were both formed well by the sea and by these animals that they loved, and also were malformed by some of their own economic practices and the way that they did their whaling. Even today, right now, there is a ban on whaling, and I know Japan in 2019 said that they would start commercial whaling irregardless of the ban. And it does raise questions for me about what it might mean to kill and eat and use some of these beautiful creatures in a way that kind of respects them and does justice to them. Maybe we need to put a Jewish rabbi on all the Japanese whaling boats and see what happens. I don't know. So anyway, those were, some of my thoughts about, one of the aspects of ethics in this book that I think is really interesting is the way that the practices of these people, both in terms of their whaling and their life on the sea, shaped and formed them ethically and morally. So yeah, that was intriguing to me.
Very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the characters that we encounter in this book, specifically with the captain, and then contrast him with maybe some of the other crew.
Right. So so in this book, Philbrick and others set up a real large contrast between Captain Pollard and the first mate, Chase, and it's really interesting to me how Philbrick sets up some of these contrasts between them. There's a great there's two quotes as I think about the way that they talk about authority on the boat and the different patterns of leadership. Those feel really important to me, both in this book as well as in today's world. There's one quote that it's on page 100 where they talk about being a fishy person. I thought was a great metaphor. It's on page 100. Let's see. Right, page 100. Here's a paragraph that I'll read to you. It's Pollard had known better, but instead of pulling rank and insisting that his officers carry out his proposal to sail for the Society Islands, He embraced a more democratic style of command. Modern survival psychologists have determined that this social, as opposed to authoritarian, form of leadership is ill-suited to the early stages of a disaster, when decisions must be made quickly and firmly. Only later, as the ordeal drags on and is necessary to maintain morale, do social leadership skills become important. Whalemen in the 19th century had a clear understanding of these two approaches. The captain was expected to be the authoritarian, what Nantuckers called a fishy man. And they use this word of fishy man in different places throughout the book. I think it's really interesting. Why is somebody fishy or not? I don't think it's how they smell. I think it's probably, this idea of being a fishy man. They see that there's a certain way that authority needs to happen on the sea as opposed to the land. And Philbrick works on this, but I actually kind of question some of the ways that he characterizes both Pollard and Chase. For instance, that page 100 is where they made this bad decision to go east to try and get back to South America after the Essex sinks, rather than going west to the Society Islands. And Pollard thinks, the captain, he thinks that they should go west, but then he consults with his other mates and takes their advice and decides to go east back. And so it seems like Philbrick, as well as others, they criticize Pollard because he didn't kind of stick to his guns. And I'm not quite sure that actually captures it. For instance, let's say that Chase, in his opinion, that he was the captain, right? And he thought that he should go to South America. And Pollard, the first mate, said, no, I think it would be better to go to the Society Islands because of this and this. And they had a democratic conversation where they're reasoning about the best course of action. And then the captain decides which way to go. Right. That seems to me like that the issue here is not whether it's authoritarian or democratic, but whether it's wise or stupid. Right. It's kind of the decision that's made, not the way that it was made, that seems to be of issue in this instance. I've been on boats, right? And so in fact, I'm on a racing yacht right now, and decisions need to be made quickly in boats at different points. And, there's a lot that's at stake. You just can't have these larger discussions about, whether somebody should pull a line or whether you should, make a tack or make this maneuver. If you do, you could, crash into another boat. So there's reasons why somebody needs to be clearly in command and decisions need to be handed out. But even in a sail race, there's discussions that go on in the back of the boat with the tacticians, and people are discussing and giving reasons for the ways that they think that they should go, and finally the captain makes a decision. And that feels quite democratic to me. And so this kind of this way of contrasting authoritarianism with democratic action, I sort of take issue with the way that Philbrick does it. For me, I'm really sensitive to the fact that in our larger culture right now, we're having quite a few discussions about authoritarian leadership versus our experiment of democracy here in America. So I kind of want to, cast my lot with democracy.
All right.
and so I'm not sure that even all fishy men and people who are in charge of boats necessarily the best way to be is authoritarian. Even early in the book, Chase, right? He thinks that he needs to be this authoritarian first mate. And in fact, he drives his crew so hard that after the first blowdown that they have, he's frightened that the crew is going to mutiny or just take off at the next place that they stop. So, there's a lot of thinking around, everything from sports teams to military to boats about these different kinds of leadership styles. And at least in my experience, that there's some truth to clear chain of command and people need to make decisions. but it seems like that there's not this huge contrast between authoritarian bullheadedness, that's the best of both, and these more democratic styles of leadership. It's interesting. Later on, toward the end of the book, Pollard also makes another mistake in leadership. It's after the Essex sinks and he finally gets rescued, he's given the command of another boat. I forget what the name of the boat. It was like I have a page number written down in my notes. It's 209, where he finds himself in another shipwreck situation again. Yeah, it's on page 209. So Philbrick writes about this. He says, the ship was being pounded to pieces on a coral reef. Captain Pollard seemed to stand amazed at the scene before him, Nickerson remembered. First mate Eben Gardner leaped into the breach. He ordered the men to begin cutting down the masts in hope of saving the ship. Realizing that the spars would likely fall across and crush the whaleboats tied to the deck, Pollard finally came to life. So here it's not a question of authoritarianism versus democratic. It's a question about whether or not the leader is aware of what's going on and able to take the responsibility of leading this larger organism called the boat of the team at that time. And the way that this idea of a fishing man being an authoritarian and bullheaded, I just don't think is quite the issue. So I might respectfully take a little issue with some of the way that Philbrick talks about some of these things in terms of kind of the needs on the ocean for an authoritarian kind of leadership.
We kind of get a glimpse of this as we look into what's happening in the boats, these whaling boats. I want to take us to that next phase. This is an important part of our story tonight. Is we've got these whaling boats, and the Essex has sunk in 10 minutes. We've looked at that. They've gathered up some of their provisions, whatever they could salvage, but now they're faced with the crisis about sailing here or there. But things get a little bit worse, don't they? Tell us about that and how they handle that.
Yeah, there's a couple things going on in these boats. As they get into the boats. One has to do with this kind of social structure about what's going on, and that has it both has to do, how would you say, with different kinds of classes of people, how we categorize people, as well as race, which I think is really intriguing as we look at this boat. And then, of course, there's kind of the final issue of cannibalism. But so here, let me ponder with you a little bit about some of the ways that that people are categorized in these boats. It's really interesting with the Nantucket and the Quakers. The Quakers were so. So let me take you to one scene, and I think that'll open this discussion a little bit. It's on page 33, right at the beginning, and there's two ways that people end up getting categorized on the boat. One is it's like they have team captains. It just reminds me of something that happened in junior high all the time, right? You pick 3 team captains, and then they pick their watchmen, or the people on the watch, right? So they pick their team, and then the same thing happens when they get into the different boats. When they're the different whale boats as they go and hunt the whale, but then also it's the survival boats. They become the survival boats when they're trying to survive. It's on page 33. Yes. Yeah, like children picking teams on a playground. The mate and second mate took turns choosing the men who would serve in their watches. The first step taken by the officers, said William Comstock, is to discover who are natives of the island and who are strangers. The honor of being a Roman citizen was not in the days of yore so enviable a distinction as it is on board one of these ships. To be a native of that sandbank, ye leapt Nantucket. And that's into the quote. It says, once the Nantuckers had all been picked, with Nickerson taken by Chase, the mates chose among the Cape Codders and the blacks. So there's this, and even within there, you can see this sort of hierarchy. The first one has to do with kin, where Pollard chooses his cousin, Owen Coffin. And then, so you kind of have this kinship bond. And then beyond that, it's the people, the islanders of Nantucket. And then beyond that, they talk about the Cape Codders and the blacks. There's something that's really interesting that's going on here too, is one has to do with kind of tribe and place, and then there is also race. In other words, if you're African American, some of those African Americans were probably born on Nantucket or on Cape Cod, but they were not seen as Nantuckers or Cape Codders. You know, there's a movement called the New Black Theology that is very Willie Jennings, J. Cameron Carter, people I know Jennings' work better. But one of the things that Jennings does is he points out the relationship between race and place. Is like, if you know, as a Christian theologian and ethicist, I will often turn to the Bible. And so if I want to find out about race in the Bible, I can't, because there's not that category. There are tribes and nations, and these are kind of distributed according to geographic aspects. So if you're an Ethiopian, that means you're from Ethiopia. But here, notice how the things get mixed. There's Nantucket, Cape Cod, and the blacks. And so this category of race has been somehow taken away from place. And so they end up being on the lowest rung of this totem pole. And there's a real problem with this. You know, let's say that Thomas Jefferson had a child with a black woman. You can see that that this child, it depends on how this child looks, and may or may not even be given the full rights of kinship with somebody like Thomas Jefferson, nor may they have been considered like a true Virginian if they were in there, or a true Nantucker, I guess you could say as well. And that seems so problematic to me. And I think one of the aspects of this kind of racial condition that we're in the 20th century is, first of all, it's pseudoscience, and it finally maps the world in ways that well, they're pernicious, as well as they simply don't, they run afoul of good sense as well. So when they select people on the boats, it's not a meritocracy, but it has to do with almost these kind of more tribal affiliations. In some ways it can make sense, because, you know, if you want somebody on your team, you want to be able to work well with them. But in other places, they were talking about how the blacks on this boat were paid the same as the other races, even though they weren't treated as equals another way. Then they were put in different parts of the boat, and they had to sleep in different places too. So it's really interesting to see these different categories and how they work in terms of these hierarchies within the boat. And of course, it's quite problematic. So even though they were abolitionists, right, they were not, how would you say, they didn't see people as equal, but saw them through these racial categories. And it should be said too, of course, that it was the black crewmates who were the first that were eaten, and there could be some sense.
Yeah, well, let's move over to the subject of cannibalism. I mean, you mentioned already that that blacks were chosen last in this hierarchy of picking your teammates, right? And then in the housing on the ship, they did not get the same quality of housing. The bunks were there. There was a closet kind of in the back of the ship that all the black sailors slept in, even though they're getting paid the same.
And sometimes they take on the same kind of responsibilities. It's it feels almost like a, I don't know if schizophrenic's the right word, but it's there's a lot of things going on all at once, and they don't make sense. And that would be one way of putting it. And so when they end up into kind of situations of cannibalism, it is the blacks who die first and get eaten first. I mean, there's questions raised about, why did they die first? and Philbrick, and I think that's, I'll accept his historical judgment on here, was surmising, in fact, that they were not treated the same. I mean, their diets were not as well, and so they were not as able to outlast, extreme situations of hunger and starvation, and that would make sense to me too. But it's interesting to see how that kind of works its way into the way that they understood and even I guess rationalize different aspects of cannibalism that happened on those boats too.
That's a curious thing that happens when before you tell us this connection, cannibalism, and I know that you got something big that you want to talk about here, but I want to ask you about, Philbrick talks about the black sailors as being a source of comfort, leading prayers and singing, and this other sailors looking to them. And historically, he says this is the way it's been, that looking at the black sailors as being more spiritual. Tell me about that. How does that play into their being treated so poorly?
I don't. It's hard for me to understand. I don't even know if I have too much to add to that, other than that it feels like that the blacks were treated well in some instances, looked up to. I mean, and in other ways they were treated horribly. It was interesting for me too that Philbrick pointed out that there were some, like almost all black whaling ships that were part of this kind of Nantucket community. And I just find it fascinating. It's hard for me to put myself in the position of that whole Nantucket society to understand how they thought about everything too. But I think it's kind of interesting.
Well, what I've been dying to hear now, I've been waiting all day to hear you talk about cannibalism. Everybody wants to hear about cannibalism with this book. Right. Is that the real story here? Is there something else going on? We have to look a little deeper here. I mean, we want to hear an ethicist talk about something that sounds so horrible, but still, I can't turn away. I've got to hear this.
Well, it's so funny because when I was thinking about this book, I thought, well, the big ethical issue is cannibalism. And I thought, well, what do I know about cannibalism? I actually did a biblical search on, so I did a Google search. I said, biblical verses on cannibalism. Okay. And I thought, well, there's not going to be any. Turns out 51 popped up. I thought that was kind of fascinating. In fact, let me... what's so interesting is, let's see, where's my Bible here? Let me grab this. One of the ones that stood out to me was Hosea 3:1-4. And, we were talking, well, here, I'll just read it. So this is, Micah 3:1-4. It says, and I said, listen, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, should you not know justice? You who hate evil and hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people and the flesh off their bones, who eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin off them, break their bones in pieces, chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron. So, it's a metaphor. It's for injustice, for the injustice that's happening to the people as they're eating it's like they're cutting them up and eating them. I think that at first I thought that cannibalism is sort of like this sidelight, but I think cannibalism opens up some very deep understandings of justice and the respect and honor that we owe people and their bodies. And the more I've thought about cannibalism, it's not a typical thing I teach on, right? The more I think maybe I should. It's really interesting. So here's on page 171. It's a good quote that can get us into that. 171 at the top. So Philbrick writes, sailors commonly accepted the eating human flesh brought a person's moral character down to the level of those, quote, brutish savages who voluntarily indulged in cannibalism. there's a lot in that quote that's really interesting. So they understand that eating human flesh brings a person's moral character down. So maybe we should do that. And then this idea of comparing it to the brutish savages is, of course, quite interesting, given their whaling practices. But the idea, why would we think that eating somebody would drop your moral character? Maybe we should unpack that a little bit. I think one of the aspects is the respect that we owe one another's bodies, even our dead bodies. This has been an issue within war, within medical ethics, as well as within cannibalism. The respect that we owe one another's bodies, even when we're dead, is kind of intriguing. Even going back to the Iliad, there's this scene where Achilles is, I think he's pulling around behind him Hector's body in a chariot, and finally the gods kind of break this up. They say, this is just not right. You can't, even though Hector's dead, you can't disrespect his body in that way. And so this idea of the respect that we owe one another's bodies, even dead bodies, I think is important to look at. But we eat dead bodies all the time, right? I eat chicken, I eat beef. I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian at this point. I'm trying in my ethical manner to, my wife and I talk about being vegetable forward, right? We're trying to reduce our meat because of the circumstances of the taking of animal life that occurs around us. But even as we eat animals and eat dead bodies, there's some ways that we should do that in a way that respects them, certainly having to do with human bodies as well. There's something about the dignity of the human that seems to be disrespected by cannibalism. We are in some appalled, and we would want to say we don't do that with human bodies, even though there's no harm to the person that's being done. It seems so. One aspect has to do with disrespect of the person's dignity, of who they are. There's been debates, even within the Christian community over time, about burial versus cremation, and even the on our driver's licenses we can become donors for science, and so there's aspects where in fact we use think about the use of body parts to keep other people alive. Is that we say that might be okay, but so it's almost the way that we do this, and it's interesting even in these situations of cannibalism, where it becomes kind of this last resort, in order to save life, that you could somehow use the bodies in order to save life. People seem to be okay with that. I mean, so that's even when the sailors get back to Nantucket, it's not like they're people see it as tragic and horrific. But it's not like they become moral outcasts because of that, which is interesting to think about it. So there's something about the dignity that perhaps can be overcome in certain circumstances, depending on how you use that. Like I would say, okay, it's okay to use my liver after I die and put it in somebody else's bodies in order to save their life. But I do care, and I think we should care what happens to our body and the way that we treat bodies after we die. But it seems like there's more than that, right? There's this, there's something intimate about eating that also seems to violate certain kinds of bonds of intimacy. I think about this like with people, with the way they treat dead animals, right? If you have a pet and you name your pet, the idea of in some ways violating those bonds of intimacy in that way seems quite repellent to us, or at least some of us. I know my wife had a pig when she was growing up, in Princess Gunther, and and while she was away, her parents had the pig slaughtered, and they ended up eating it. Right? Well, so this is is that a violation? Is that okay? But it seems like we're okay with eating pigs, but it seems like that we're violating these kind of intimate bonds. You find that in this story too. Pollard ends up eating his cousin Owen Coffin, and there was actually a joke that was made about that toward the end of the book that I thought was a little bit telling. That has to do with these kind of bonds of kinship and bonds of intimacy. It's on page 212. So Philbrick writes, there was another rumor about Captain Pollard. It claimed that a newly arrived off-islander innocently asked him if he had ever known a man named Owen Coffin. Know him, Pollard was reputed to have replied. Why, I ate him. and Philbrick and others say, well, but it's interesting how this idea of eating and knowing gets traded off even in this in the punchline. I mean, there's ways of taste. When you put something in your mouth, you think about kissing people, the way that we are intimate with others. It's that the idea of I won't linger on this too long, but there's this intimacy of tasting that is that's part of I think part of this as well. They even talked about that eating your cousin is incestuous. That's an interesting metaphor to use for that as well. There's kind of I mean, it's the same with sexuality and sexual violence, right? There's these ways that we know each other and are quite intimate that are some of the most beautiful aspects of human life. And they're also the ways that people can be degraded the most. Wrong knowing and wrong different kinds of intimacy of that fashion can be so degrading and hurtful to people's own sense of themselves. And I feel like something like that is happening in cannibalism, especially with people that we know. And so it's interesting that even, going back to the African Americans being eaten first, there's this idea, certainly there could be this kind of racial subhuman thing going on, but also there's a sense where it's like they're more distant to us, less intimate. We have less close bonds with these people, so therefore it's not as horrific or not as disgusting in some ways to partake of this practice. So I think there's something about the dignity of the human body as well as this odd sense of intimacy of dealing with bodies. They often said too that even in sorry to go into detail, but in the cannibalistic practice, they would often cut off their heads, their hands, and their feet. They would have to almost dehumanize so they wouldn't recognize the identity of these people in order to distance themselves from that kind of intimate connection with them. And so I think this cannibalistic practice shows this aspect of the wrong kind of intimacy that can be taking place. So, right. And then there's a third aspect to it that is brought out even in that quote, having to do with kind of primitive versus civilized. And that's another, I think, disturbing aspect, is that cannibalism has been often seen as kind of a practice of uncivilized people. And so there's certainly a kind of racism that's mixed in with that as well. I mean, certainly, a cannibalism that thinks it's okay to go kill somebody because they make a good food for them is okay. I mean, is something that we should shun for murder as well as cannibalistic practices of disrespect. But this idea of naming these as brutish savages is, I think, an interesting aspect of what's going on in the way cannibalism is seen that perhaps is more problematic than the first two. So, I guess, my point here is that what we do with human bodies matters. How we treat them is so important. I guess as I, end my thoughts about cannibalism, it makes me think about in two very different directions. It makes me think about the Eucharist as well as about the movement of Black Lives Matter. About the Eucharist, the early Christians were often accused of being cannibals, and which is, people would think, well, why that? Well, we say, part of the Eucharistic prayer or our liturgies and the words that we use at the Lord's Supper are things like, "This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for you. Come to the feast. All is ready." I mean, there's a way that you strip it down and you see that there's these, it sounds like cannibalism. And what's interesting, though, is that that sense of intimacy is brought out there, too. We say, "Taste and see that the Lord is good." There's, I think, this idea of sharing oneself in a very deep way is quite an amazing aspect of Christianity, is that we see that God would, first of all, take on human flesh and then want to share that life with us. And I think the symbolism and the metaphor and the sacramental realities that we are pointing to is this way of somehow participating in the very being of God in through these sacramental activities that I think is really interesting to think about in relationship to cannibalism and kind of the intimacy, a bad kind of intimacy versus a spectacular and wonderful kind of intimacy that can be related there too. One other connection, Dan, sorry to talk about cannibalism so long, but is the Black Lives Matter movement. I remember reading this book by Ta-Nehisi Coates called Between the World and Me. And in that book, I was really struck as he's talking about his experience as a Black man and talking about the fear for his body. He used the word body a lot. And the way that we treat one another's bodies is so important, and shows, whether you put a knee on somebody's neck or whether you greet them with a hug. It's there's very different ways that we need to learn how to honor and respect and do justice to one another's bodies, both while we're living, certainly, but even after we die. So I'm fascinated by these, by the way that we treat bodies and some of the taboos, some of the understandings around it, why we think things are horrible or not, as well as these images of intimacy that have to do with sharing bodies, both in human sexuality as well as in places like the Lord's Supper. I think that we need to pay attention to those kind of movements that are going on in our culture and the way that we can do justice to one another in all avenues of our life.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stubbs. We've been talking to Dr. David Stubbs, a theologian and ethicist at Western Theological Seminary, and the book is The Heart of the Sea. It's available for free at the seminary, also at Hope College, and many places throughout the Lakeshore region. Thank you very much on behalf of the NEA Lakeshore. Thanks for all of you for watching tonight. Good night, and God bless.
Thank you, Dan.